Hello, this is my video response to Carol's post of questions for her presentation, and I'd like to specifically address question number 1 and a little bit on question number 2. So question number 1 starts off with identify challenges that policymakers, researchers, and state educational departments may face in redefining high school graduation curriculums and college entrance preparation policies. And it's a two-part question, so I'll just look at part 1 first. I almost feel like I've cheated because I have watched Dr. Ryder's video talking about this, and he made such a wonderful connection when he tied us back to the very beginning of the semester when we looked at Birnbaum's article, Policy Scholars Are from Venus, Policymakers Are from Mars. And one of the statements that they make in that article at the very end in the conclusion was that policy scholarship and policy making are and ought to be two distinct knowledge-producing activities whose insights may inform each other but are not dependent on each other. And I thought that was a really good statement to kind of sum it up, that we need them to be different, and they are very different. And I've also thought about what Kristen mentioned in her video when she served as our guest speaker this semester, and in some of the other conversations that I've had with Kristen about advocacy and how the best way to communicate with those policymakers is to go and actually see them in person and to talk with them and not just send emails. And so I take what she talks about with the advocacy and taking what Birnbaum says and kind of tie the two together, and I think, you know, yes, they get the research as far as a written document, but to have somebody have a conversation with them about the research would probably make such a better impact and a bigger impact and help make it more understandable and more relevant. So again, I think if you kind of tie those two things together, the article and then what Kristen has shared with us, and know that advocating that research to the policymakers through a personal visit and maybe an actual presentation of the research instead of just providing the end document to them, I think would make a much more powerful impact on our policymakers. So I think that's a challenge, is that policymakers probably receive lots of research, but it's not presented to them in as meaningful of a way as it could be, or as a lasting way. And one of the things that really impacted me this semester is by going to some of the sites that Dr. Ryder provided to us, particularly the state site, and trying to follow through on some of the education bills that were in Raleigh this summer, and just watching them and watching the process throughout the course of just this class. I was amazed and couldn't keep up with it. And it really made me think about these people who are there on the ground working with this. They don't just deal with the bills that have to do with education. They're dealing with the bills that have to do with everything. And I was having a hard time keeping up with just the ones that had to do with education, and that's my passion and that's my background. And it really gave me a new respect for what they were dealing with and the scope and the magnitude of what they're dealing with. So I can see how a piece of research can become minute in the mass of what they're looking at and the mass of what they're dealing with. So again, Kristen's insight of making it a little bit more personal than an email really stood out to me, and I could appreciate why that could be when I looked at the volume of what they're reading and what they're dealing with. So part 2 of question 1 had to do with what strategies might facilitate an easier process. And to me, that was a tough question because I think if we had the answers, then boy, we'd probably have some really great careers ahead of us. I do think, though, that some of the things like those personal visits that Kristen suggested in her video definitely help. The collaboration that we've all been talking about, I think, definitely helps. I think some of the things that our governor is doing currently, and definitely not saying that as a political statement or pro or con the governor necessarily, but having teachers serve as experts, I think is an excellent model, where we do have currently several teachers who are there to serve as experts and to provide input into policy and policy making. And having fellowships like what Kristen is doing is a really, really excellent opportunity as well, to hear the voice of teachers and to hear her say things, particularly her answer to the last question on her video was so encouraging and optimistic to me. And it offered so much hope at a time when I think so many educators feel discouraged and at wit's end with trying to come to grasp with where we are with policy, and they just feel quite beaten down, quite honestly, with where we've been for the last probably decade. So it just offered a great deal of hope and inspiration in my eyes. So I thought that that was really a very hopeful thing, and I think that more steps in that direction is probably my best effort at saying those are good strategies that could facilitate and make the process easier. Because that's more of a collaboration, and that's something that I've heard you all as my colleagues and peers say over and over again throughout the course of this class. So that would be my best suggestion there. And I'll only briefly mention question 2 just so that for the sake of time, and it was, what challenges might policymakers and state education departments face in redefining equalization of student access and diversity policies relative to financial aid affecting college retention and completion, or should this be handled at the federal level? Why or why not? I see that this is already, I don't see this as much of a choice. I feel like it's already handled at a large extent at the federal level for students who receive federal financial aid through Pell Grant. Pell Grant and the federal financial aid recipients already are under so many guidelines when they receive that money, and through everything from the application process, which is now directly linked to their federal income tax, and if they're not linking it, they're not getting qualified to receive it. If they are getting the aid, there are now all kinds of measures put in place as far as 150% maximum time frame goes into effect, how many times you could take a class. There's a lot of rules within the last several years that have been implemented to address several of the things in this question, as far as it's really intended to stop abuse, which was necessary and needed, but it does have a lot to do with making sure that students are moving along and completing, and that they're not just floundering in the water, so to speak. So I do think that already there is a lot of rules and regulations on the federal level, and then the state can come in and complement those or add to them, but you can't subtract away what was already put in place by the federal at the federal level, unless you'd like to relinquish those federal aids and grants. I don't know too many colleges that can stay in business if you do that. So I do think that we don't really have an option when it comes to the federal level. We can complement, as I said, on the state level. So I'll just leave it at that with question 2 for the sake of time. And thank you so much, Carol, for the great questions and conversation.